A young man at a bustling park smirked as he noticed an elderly veteran wearing a tattered uniform adorned with medals. "Those rusty trinkets don't make you a hero, old man," he jeered, drawing attention from passersby. The veteran's hand trembled, but his voice was steady. "You don't know the weight of these medals." Unbeknownst to the young man, a story of sacrifice, courage, and haunting loss was about to unravel, one that would forever change his perspective on life, honor, and humanity. The sun hung low over the bustling city park, casting long shadows on the manicured lawns and pathways. Justin, a 22-year-old college student, strolled through the park with his headphones blasting music, a casual swagger in his step. To him, the park was just a shortcut, ordinary and unremarkable. Today, however, something unusual caught his attention. An elderly man sat alone on a weathered bench, dressed in a faded military uniform adorned with medals. Some medals gleamed under the sunlight, while others had dulled with time. The man's hands rested on a wooden cane, his posture upright yet heavy with age and experience. Passersby glanced his way, some with quiet respect, others with indifference. To Justin, however, the medals were nothing but relics of a bygone era. Rusty trinkets, as he would later call them. Justin smirked as he walked closer, his curiosity piqued by what he saw as the old man's attempt to draw attention. "What a show-off," he muttered under his breath. His voice was low, but loud enough for a few nearby parkgoers to hear. Always one to disdain overt displays of patriotism, Justin had grown up dismissing such things as irrelevant. To him, the past was the past, something that no longer mattered. Pulling his headphones down to rest around his neck, Justin crossed his arms and approached the bench. Standing a few feet away, he tilted his head and spoke loudly, his words laced with mockery. "So, you sit here every day showing off those medals. Do you think that makes you a hero or something?" The park seemed to pause in time. Conversations faded, joggers slowed their pace, and the sound of birdsong dimmed. The elderly man looked up slowly, his piercing gray eyes meeting Justin's with a steady, unflinching gaze. There was no anger in those eyes, only a calm intensity that made Justin falter slightly. "Do you know what these medals mean, son?" the old man asked, his voice low and deliberate. Justin shrugged, a smirk still playing on his lips. "They mean, you fought in some war. Big deal. People fight wars all the time. What makes you special?" The man's grip on his cane tightened, but his expression didn't change. Instead, he gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. "Sit down," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "If you've got the time to mock me, you've got the time to listen." Justin hesitated, glancing around at the growing number of onlookers. Their silent stares bore into him, but a strange pull, whether it was curiosity or the need to prove himself, made him stay. He dropped onto the bench with an exaggerated sigh, slouching as far back as he could. The old man adjusted his position, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "My name is Benigno," he began. "I was a soldier during the war, not because I wanted to be, but because I had to be. Back then, there was no choice. You fought or you lost everything." Justin rolled his eyes but said nothing. There was something in the man's voice, something raw and unshakable, that kept him from interrupting. Benigno's fingers brushed against one of the medals on his chest, lingering there as though it carried the weight of a memory. "This one," he said, his voice softening, "was for bravery in the face of the enemy. But bravery isn't what I see when I look at it. I see Mario." "Who's Mario?" Justin asked, his curiosity surfacing despite himself. Benigno's lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes grew distant. "Mario was my best friend. We grew up together, went to school together, and enlisted together. During one mission, we were ambushed. The enemy had us pinned down. When a grenade landed near us, Mario, he didn't even think. He just threw himself on it, saved the rest of us. That's what this medal represents, a life given so others could live." Justin shifted uncomfortably, the smirk long gone from his face. He stared at the ground, unsure of what to say. "These medals," Benigno continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "aren't about me. They're about the people I fought alongside, the ones who didn't come back. Every one of these trinkets, as you call them, is a reminder of the cost of war. A cost people like you take for granted." Justin felt his cheeks grow warm, the sting of guilt settling in. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. Benigno turned to him, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Because you need to hear it," he said. "People like you, young, arrogant, and ungrateful, need to understand what was sacrificed so that you could live the life you do. These medals aren't a boast. They're a warning, a reminder that freedom always comes at a cost." The sun dipped lower, casting the park in hues of gold and amber. Justin stood awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. I need to go," he muttered. "But thanks for, sharing your story." Benigno nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Take care, son, and remember what I said." Justin walked away, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't shake the image of the old man sitting alone on the bench, his medals gleaming faintly in the fading light. For the first time in his life, Justin wondered what it truly meant to live a life of courage and sacrifice. The next morning, Justin couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Benigno. The old man's words haunted him, vivid and heavy, replaying in his mind like a record on repeat. He wasn't the type to dwell on things, least of all a chance encounter in a park, but this felt different. There was something about the story, about the quiet, unwavering way Benigno had spoken that gnawed at him. He found himself heading back to the park, driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. When he arrived, the bench where Benigno had sat was empty. For reasons he didn't fully understand, Justin felt a twinge of disappointment. He lingered for a moment, unsure whether to leave, when he noticed a familiar figure standing a few steps away. Benigno was by a tree, its low-hanging branches swaying in the breeze. In his hand, the old man held a single medal that seemed to catch the light more brightly than the others. Justin hesitated. This time there was no mocking smirk, no smugness. He approached cautiously. "Hey," he called out, his voice quieter than usual. "What are you doing?" Benigno turned, his expression soft but distant. "Thinking," he said simply, his voice steady. He glanced at the medal in his hand before holding it up for Justin to see. "This is the first one I ever received, the one that means the most to me." Justin frowned, curiosity sparking again. "Why does it mean the most?" Benigno sighed, his gaze drifting past Justin as if seeing something far away. "Because it's not mine," he said quietly. "It belongs to Mario." Justin blinked in confusion. "Wait, you mean the friend you talked about yesterday? The one who—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Benigno nodded anyway. "I kept it for him," the old man explained, his voice tinged with a sorrow that seemed decades old. "He earned it, but he wasn't around to receive it. It was awarded posthumously, and I accepted it on his behalf. I promised his mother I'd keep it safe for him, to honor his memory. And every time I look at it, I remember what it cost him." Justin shifted uncomfortably. "You said he jumped on a grenade. That's insane. How do you even make a decision like that?" Benigno's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes glistening. "You don't decide," he said after a pause. "Not really. In that moment, your training takes over. But more than that, your love for the people beside you does. Mario didn't think. He just acted. And that act saved the lives of everyone else in our unit, including me." Justin tried to imagine it. The chaos, the fear, but the image felt unreal. "Did you ever feel guilty?" he asked hesitantly. "For surviving when he didn't?" Benigno's gaze darkened and he let out a deep sigh. "Every single day," he admitted. There were nights I couldn't sleep, thinking about how unfair it was. Mario had so much to live for. He was going to marry his sweetheart, open a repair shop, have a family. And me? I didn't have any grand plans. I was just a farm boy who got drafted. Why did he have to die, and not me? The weight of Benigno's words settled heavily between them. For the first time, Justin found himself wondering how anyone could carry that kind of burden for so long without breaking. So, what did you do? Justin asked finally. How did you deal with it? I didn't. Not for a long time, Benigno admitted. I tried to bury it, pretend it didn't happen, but memories catch up with you, no matter how hard you run. Eventually, I realized the only way to honor Mario was to live the life he gave me, to make it worth something. Justin frowned. How do you even begin to do that? Benigno smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. By remembering, he said, by keeping their stories alive. That's why I come here, why I wear these medals. Not to show off, but to remind people like you that every one of these has a story, a life behind it. Justin felt a lump in his throat, but quickly swallowed it. And that's why you keep Mario's medal with you? Yes, Benigno said simply, because his story deserves to be told. People need to know what he did and why it matters, and as long as I'm alive, I'll keep telling it. The sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the park. Justin looked at the medal in Benigno's hand, seeing it not as a piece of metal but as a symbol of something far greater: sacrifice, loyalty, and love. I don't think I'll ever understand what that's like, Justin said quietly, to do something so selfless. Benigno glanced at him, his expression softening. Maybe you don't have to understand it, he said. Maybe it's enough that you respect it. For the first time in years, Justin felt humbled. He looked at the ground, then back at Benigno. Thanks for telling me, he said, about Mario and everything. Benigno nodded, slipping the medal back into his pocket. Thank you for listening, he replied. That's all I ask. As Justin walked away from the park that day, he felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt, awe, and something resembling gratitude. He couldn't shake the image of Mario, a young man he'd never met, giving his life for others without hesitation. It was a story he knew he would carry with him for a long time. For days, Justin found himself returning to the park, drawn back to Benigno's stories like a moth to a flame. Each time, the old man sat on the same bench, a quiet, steady presence in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. Justin didn't know why he kept coming back. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way Benigno's words made him feel, like there was something bigger than himself he had never bothered to see before. One crisp morning, Justin arrived to find Benigno holding another medal. This one caught the sunlight differently, its design intricate and almost regal. Without hesitation, Justin sat beside him, no longer waiting for an invitation. "Morning," Justin greeted. "Good morning, son," Benigno replied, his tone thoughtful. He held up the medal, turning it slowly in his fingers. "This one's from a rescue mission, but it's not just about the mission. It's about a choice I'll never stop questioning." Justin leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of rescue mission?" Benigno sighed deeply, his gaze drifting far away. "It was late in the war. Our unit was sent to evacuate a village caught in the crossfire. The enemy was advancing quickly and time wasn't on our side. Our orders were clear: get as many civilians out as possible before the village fell." He paused, the weight of his memories visible in the way his shoulders sagged. "When we arrived, the scene was chaos. Smoke filled the air, homes were burning, families were screaming, and gunfire echoed in every direction. We had to move fast, making decisions in seconds. Who to save, who to leave behind. It was impossible to save everyone." Justin stayed silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. "What did you do?" he asked softly. Benigno exhaled, his fingers brushing over the metal. I found a little girl, maybe 6 years old. She was trapped under rubble, her leg broken. She couldn't walk, and she was too scared to cry. I pulled her out and carried her, shielding her with my body as we ran to the trucks. Bullets were flying past us, explosions going off everywhere. I don't know how we made it out alive. Justin's breath caught. "You saved her," he said, his voice tinged with awe. Benigno's expression darkened. "I did, but it came at a cost." "What kind of cost?" The old man's voice grew quieter. There was an older woman nearby, crying out for help. She couldn't walk either. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her I couldn't help her. There were others, too. Parents searching for their children, children crying for their parents. I could only carry one. I chose the girl because she was closest, because I couldn't bear to leave her there alone. But that choice... He trailed off, his voice cracking slightly. That choice has haunted me every day since. Justin swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. But you saved someone. That has to count for something. Benigno nodded slowly, his face unreadable. It does, but it doesn't erase the faces of the ones I couldn't save. Those faces never leave you. That's the burden of war. It forces you to make choices no one should ever have to make. Justin looked away, his mind racing. He couldn't imagine living with such memories, with the weight of decisions made in moments of sheer chaos. "Did the girl survive?" he asked finally. "She did," Benigno said. "We got her to safety and she was treated for her injuries. I never saw her again, but I like to think she grew up, that she had a chance at life. That thought is what keeps the guilt at bay, most of the time." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Benigno's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Justin realized then that the medals weren't just symbols of honor. They were symbols of survival, of loss, of choices no one should have to make. "You know," Justin said hesitantly, "I used to think medals were just for show, like they were something people wore to make themselves look good. But now I see they're more than that. They're reminders, aren't they?" Benigno smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Yes," he said, "reminders of what was lost, what was saved, and what it cost. They're not about glory. They're about remembering." The morning sun cast a warm, golden light over the park. For once, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was reflective, almost sacred. Justin felt like he was beginning to understand, if only a little, what it meant to carry the weight of history. "Thank you for telling me," Justin said finally. "I don't know if I'll ever fully get it, but I think I understand a little more now." Benigno nodded, his expression calm. "That's all I ask, son. For someone to listen, to try to understand." As Justin walked away that morning, he felt a quiet determination take root within him. He didn't know what he could do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the way he was before. Benigno's stories had changed him, awakened something in him that wouldn't let him turn away. For the first time, Justin wanted to be better, not just for himself, but for the people who had sacrificed everything so that he could live freely. Justin arrived at the park earlier than usual, the anticipation of another story from Benigno pulling him out of bed before the sun had fully risen. The air was crisp, and a soft morning fog hung over the grass, giving the park an almost otherworldly feel. When he reached the bench, Benigno was already there, as if he had been waiting. This time, however, there was something different about him. He seemed quieter, his gaze heavier, as though the weight of his memories was pressing down on him. Justin hesitated before sitting down. "Morning," he said softly, almost unsure of himself. "Morning, son," Benigno replied, his voice subdued. He looked down at the medal in his hand, this one less ornate than the others Justin had seen. Its dull surface seemed worn smooth by time, the edges slightly frayed. Benigno held it delicately as though it might shatter in his grip. "What's the story behind that one?" Justin asked, leaning forward slightly. Benigno's lips pressed into a thin line. "This one isn't for bravery," he said after a long pause. "It's not for saving anyone or winning a battle. It's for surviving." Justin frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Benigno took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the medal. "It's a Purple Heart," he explained, "given to those who are wounded in battle. But for me, it's more than that. It's a reminder of what I lost, of what I'll never get back." Justin didn't interrupt, sensing the gravity of what was about to be said. "It was near the end of the war," Benigno began, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of pain. "We were deep behind enemy lines on a reconnaissance mission. It was supposed to be quick and quiet, get in, gather intel, and get out. But things went wrong, as they often did in war." He paused, his hands tightening around the medal. "We walked into an ambush. They were waiting for us. The first explosion hit before we even knew what was happening. I remember the sound more than anything. This deafening roar that seemed to swallow everything. And then the pain. It was indescribable." Justin felt his chest tighten. "What happened?" he asked softly. Benigno lifted his pant leg slightly, revealing the edge of a prosthetic limb. "I lost my leg that day," he said simply. "Shrapnel tore through it. There was no saving it. My comrades risked their lives to drag me out of there. They're the reason I'm still here." Justin's eyes widened, his mind racing to process the revelation. I didn't know," he stammered. Benigno smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not something I talk about often. Not because I'm ashamed, but because it's hard to explain. Losing a part of yourself, it changes you. Not just physically, but mentally. You start questioning everything. Why you survived when others didn't. Whether you're still whole, whether you're still you." Justin nodded slowly, his respect for the old man deepening with every word. "How did you deal with it?" he asked. "At first I didn't," Benigno admitted. "I was angry, at the world, at myself, at the war. I pushed people away, convinced myself that I was broken, useless. It took me years to realize that my worth wasn't tied to what I had lost, that even with one leg I could still stand tall. But that realization didn't come easy." He glanced at Justin, his gaze piercing. "War doesn't just take lives, son. It takes pieces of people, pieces they can never get back. This medal," he held it up, his hand trembling slightly. "It's not a badge of honor. It's a reminder of the cost of survival, of the price paid by those who come home." Justin swallowed hard, the weight of Benigno's words pressing down on him. "Do you ever wish—" He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the question. "That I hadn't survived?" Benigno asked, his tone neutral. "Sometimes, especially in the beginning. But now I see things differently. I see the value in the life I still have, and I see it as my duty to honor the ones who didn't make it back, to carry their stories, their memories, so that they're never forgotten." The old man's gaze drifted to the horizon, his voice softening. "This prosthetic, it's just a piece of metal and plastic, but the people who gave their lives to save me, they were flesh and blood. Their sacrifice is what matters, and every step I take, every breath I breathe, is a testament to them." The two sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the park fading into the background. Justin found himself looking at Benigno in a new light, not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to resilience. "Thank you," Justin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "for sharing this with me. For everything." Benigno nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you for listening, son. That's all I ask." As Justin walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions swirling within him: sadness, admiration, and a deep sense of gratitude. He couldn't help but think about the sacrifices people like Benigno had made, the invisible wounds they carried. And for the first time, he began to wonder what he could do to carry some of that weight, to honor those sacrifices in his own way. The days grew shorter, the chill of autumn creeping into the mornings. Justin continued his visits to the park, drawn to Benigno's stories and the quiet strength the old man exuded. The medals, once objects he mocked, had become symbols of sacrifices he could barely comprehend. With every visit, Justin felt his world expand, piece by piece. One morning, Justin arrived earlier than usual. The park still bathed in the pale light of dawn. Benigno was already there, staring at the horizon with a contemplative look. For the first time since their conversations began, there was no medal in his hand. Justin hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. "No medal today?" Justin asked, the absence making him uneasy. Benigno shook his head. "Not today, son. Today, I want to hear from you." The question caught Justin off guard. "From me?" "Yes." Benigno turned to face him, his gaze sharp but kind. "You've been listening to my stories for weeks now, but I'm curious. What have you learned? What do you see differently now than when we first met?" Justin hesitated, his thoughts swirling. He hadn't expected to be put on the spot, hadn't prepared for it. I don't know where to start," he admitted. "There's so much." "Then take your time," Benigno said, leaning back slightly. "Speak from the heart." Justin took a deep breath, staring at his hands as if they held the answers. "I guess I've realized how little I knew about people like you, about the sacrifices you made, the things you went through. I never thought about what it takes to live through something like that. The choices you had to make, the things you had to endure. It's not something I ever considered before." Benigno nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. "I think about the stories you've told me," Justin went on, his voice growing steadier. "Mario, the little girl, the people you had to leave behind, and I keep asking myself, what would I have done in your place? Would I have been brave enough, strong enough? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't think I could have done what you did." Benigno's expression softened. "You might surprise yourself, son. Courage isn't something you're born with. It's something you find when you need it most." Justin looked up at him, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "But you make it sound so noble. And I don't think I'm that kind of person. I've spent so much of my life being selfish, thinking only about myself. Hearing your stories, it's made me realize how small my world has been." "Realizing that is the first step to changing it," Benigno said gently. "You don't have to be a soldier to make a difference. You just have to be willing to step outside yourself to think about others. That's where courage starts." Justin fell silent, his mind racing. The old man's words felt like a challenge, one that both inspired and intimidated him. He thought about the way he'd mocked Benigno on that first day, how small and petty his actions seemed now. The shame of it lingered, but so did something else, something that felt like hope. "I want to do better," Justin said finally. "I don't know how yet, but I want to. I want to live a life that means something, like the people you've told me about. I want to make a difference." Benigno smiled, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for, son. To try, to care. The rest will come in time." The morning sun began to rise higher, casting a golden glow over the park. For the rest of the morning, they talked not about war or sacrifice, but about life, its challenges, its joys, and its purpose. Benigno shared stories of his childhood on the farm, of the lessons he'd learned, and of the people who had shaped him. And Justin, for the first time, opened up about his own life. Justin confessed his shame about mocking Benigno that first day, how he'd let arrogance and ignorance blind him to the truth. "I guess I've always been afraid to look beyond myself," he admitted. "It's easier to dismiss people, to think their struggles don't matter, because then you don't have to feel anything. You don't have to care. But listening to you, I can't do that anymore. I can't pretend I don't see it." Benigno nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy to care, son. It hurts sometimes, but it's the only way to truly live. The world doesn't need more people who turn away. It needs people willing to face the pain, to carry it, and to do something with it." Justin thought about those words long after they were spoken. When it was time to leave, he stood, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice earnest, "for everything, for teaching me." Benigno nodded, his expression warm. "Thank you for listening, son, and for being willing to learn." As Justin walked away, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go back to the way he'd been before. Benigno's stories had planted a seed in him, one he was determined to nurture. For the first time, he felt like he was on the path to becoming the person he wanted to be. Winter had settled over the city, the park now blanketed in frost. The trees stood bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a pale, gray sky. Despite the biting cold, Justin found himself drawn once again to the park. His routine visits to Benigno had become a cornerstone of his days. But today, as he approached the familiar bench, he felt a strange heaviness in the air. Benigno wasn't there. Justin paused, scanning the park as his breath clouded in front of him. It wasn't unusual for Benigno to arrive early, but he had always been there by the time Justin showed up. Something about the empty bench felt wrong. After a moment, Justin sat down, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He told himself Benigno would show up soon, but the gnawing feeling in his chest didn't go away. Minutes turned into an hour, and still, there was no sign of the old man. Justin stood, unsure of what to do. He felt a pang of guilt for not asking more about Benigno's life outside the park. Where did he live? Did he have anyone to look after him? Justin realized with a jolt how little he actually knew about the man who had shared so much of himself. On impulse, Justin decided to ask around. The park's regulars, the joggers, the dog walkers, the old men who played chess near the fountain, might know something. Approaching an elderly woman walking her small dog, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know the man who usually sits on that bench? The one with the medals?" The woman nodded, her expression somber. "Benigno? He's been coming here for years. A kind man, always polite. Why do you ask?" "I haven't seen him today," Justin said, his voice tight. "I was wondering if he's okay." The woman's face fell. "Oh, dear, you didn't hear. Benigno passed away 2 nights ago. Heart failure, they said. Peaceful, in his sleep." Justin felt the world tilt beneath him. The words didn't seem real, didn't seem possible. "He's gone?" The woman placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry. They're holding a memorial for him at the Veterans Hall tomorrow. You should go. He'd have liked that." Justin nodded numbly, barely able to process the information. He thanked the woman and walked away, his mind a whirl of emotions. Grief, regret, and an aching sense of loss filled him. He couldn't believe he'd never get to hear another of Benigno's stories, never get to thank him properly for everything he'd taught him. The next day, Justin stood outside the Veterans Hall clutching a small bouquet of white flowers. He felt out of place, a young man among the gray-haired attendees who had known Benigno far longer than he had. But he couldn't turn away. He owed it to Benigno to be here. Inside, the hall was filled with photos of Benigno, some from his youth, others from his days in uniform, and a few from recent years. Justin recognized the warm smile, the steady gaze that had become so familiar to him. Near the front of the room, a display case held Benigno's medals, each one polished to a shine. Justin approached the case, his throat tightening as he remembered the stories behind each one. As he stood there, an older man in a military dress uniform approached him. "You must be Justin," the man said, extending a hand. I'm Colonel Reyes, an old friend of Benigno's. He mentioned you." Justin shook the man's hand, surprised. "He did?" Colonel Reyes nodded. "He spoke highly of you, said you were a good listener, that you cared. That meant a lot to him." Justin felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't even know he was sick." Reyes placed a comforting hand on Justin's shoulder. He didn't like to talk about his health. He preferred to focus on living, on sharing his experiences. He saw something in you, Justin. That's why he kept coming back to the park. Justin looked down at the medals, his heart heavy. "He changed my life," he said quietly. "I just wish I could have done something for him in return." "You can," Reyes said, "by living the way he hoped you would, by carrying his stories forward, sharing what he taught you. That's how you honor someone like Benigno." At the end of the memorial, Justin was handed an envelope with his name on it. Inside was a handwritten note from Benigno, dated just a few days before his passing. Justin's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. "Dear Justin," the note began, "if you're reading this, it means my time has come. Don't be sad, son. I've lived a full life, and I'm at peace. Meeting you has been one of the greatest joys of my later years. You reminded me that the younger generation still has hope, still has heart. Carry that with you, Justin. Be brave, be kind, and never stop listening. The world needs more people like you. Yours truly, Benigno." Tears streamed down Justin's face as he read the words. He clutched the note to his chest, the weight of Benigno's final message sinking in. In that moment, Justin made a silent promise to the man who had changed his life. He would honor Benigno's memory by living with courage, compassion, and purpose. As he left the hall, Justin felt a strange sense of peace. Benigno was gone, but his stories, his lessons, and his spirit lived on. And Justin knew, deep in his heart, that he would carry them with him for the rest of his life.